BC, one of the conference's gold sponsors, to introduce our last session of the morning. So please join me in welcoming Stephen.
Good morning, everyone. Uklama, Niskoasath, Hishtakshikle Huayet. My name is Stephen Rayner. I'm an elected councillor for the Huayet First Nation, and I'm the interim executive director of Clean Energy BC. So on behalf of Clean Energy BC, the Clean Energy Association of British Columbia, I want to thank the C3 Alliance for convening the 10th Indigenous Resource Opportunities Conference. We are proud to support IROC alongside the BC Natural Resource Forum and to contribute to the space that brings together Indigenous leadership, industry, and government. Indigenous governance and leadership continue to shape resource development and moves forwards in British Columbia. Conversations about decision-making, responsibility, and long-term stewardship are central to that work. This morning's discussion will bring together two leaders with decades of experience advancing Indigenous governance and representing communities across the province. So please join me in welcoming Robert Phillips and Dallas Smith.
We should put some turnbuckles up for this one. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Testing.
Is that testy?
Testing. Oh, it might be. We'll see. Robert Phillips. How are you, man?
Pretty good. Before I begin, I want to give acknowledgments to Shanemo and for the First Nation. And Dallas said to be controversial. So I said, okay, I'll do the acknowledgement because it might be the last one. And people were going, what do you mean? Well, as you know, the BC Conservatives, I think, are talking about abolishing DRIPA as well as acknowledgements. So that's my little first controversial statement. I say that, I see Alaya over there, and I know she's speaking tomorrow, so she's going to have the last word, unfortunately.
No, thank you again. It's always nice to be in Nanaimo territory. As I mentioned yesterday, when I married into Cowichan tribes, my reception here was a lot better. It's not as good in Musqueam anymore. I guess that's an inside joke between some of us, Cowichan, Musqueam. But, you know, here we are. It's our 10th live anniversary of the BC Indigenous Resource Opportunities Conference. I know you've probably been to 4 or 5. You know, you usually stick your head in and come shake a hand and come see a few people. But there's a lot going on in BC right now. You know, and this is an interesting one. You know, I'm so glad to have the Leadership Council here to have a discussion because I'm always trashing you guys. I'm always shitting on you guys, and you know that. But at the same time, I have nothing but the most respect for all of you individually. So I really want to get into some of the discussions about the roles that we play when it comes to trying to shepherd these discussions through. You know, you've been around long enough that, you know, when we started, Delgamuuk was a big page turner. That's what got us some traction and got us some momentum. And we started to organize ourselves and start to get a little bit more, this is what we're looking for. Instead of sitting on the sidelines and talking about what we weren't getting, we started to mobilize and say, how can we do this? And so maybe for just some of the people that don't know as directly, why don't you just talk about the role of the Leadership Council a little bit, and specifically with the summit, which you're one of the representatives from.
Right. So the First Nations Summit, I'm elected by the chiefs of the First Nations Summit. It's one of 2 provincial, well, actually 3, because the BCAFN is, of course, provincial, but associated with the Assembly of First Nations. So there's the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the First Nations Summit and the BC Assembly of First Nations. And we're all elected. And for myself, I've been at it now since 2013, and prior to that as a commissioner elected by the Summit Chiefs since 2007. And then prior to that, I was the chief negotiator and self-government director with the Chilliwack, I quote it there, with the Northern Shawatan Dekelmuk, and that was part of the treaty negotiations. And in prior in Chilliwack, I was in Aboriginal Rights and Title and Justice. So if any of you out there were in trouble with the law as a young person, you would know who I am.
And if any of you are in trouble with the law as a young person, I was probably riding with you. But yet we meet on the stage years later. But there's a lot going on, Robert, and I mean, I think one of the interesting things is, while I always voice my concerns with the Leadership Council, you and I have had this friendship that's grown over the years. I mean, you were great friends with my dad when my dad was a lot more politically involved. I know, we got to sit down and have a lot of dinners together and things like that, and so we've just always been around each other. But, where we're at right now has been scary. The last, 2 years, we've been through some very close elections where First Nations issues has become a little bit of a political football. And so while I don't want to create more uncertainty and fear, let's have a little bit of a discussion about just where we were and where we're going and how we're going to continue to get there. A lot of people seem to think that DRIPA is the hang-up on this. DRIPA was simply the crystallization of decades of forward momentum on some things. And while I think it was prematurely introduced myself, I think we needed some more framework behind it so we wouldn't be running into some of these questions we're at. But just as someone who is at the table helping negotiate, the opportunities to make sure that we're raising the floor. When we started the treaty process in the 90s, everybody talked about the ceiling and how we're going to do this and how we're going to do that. And when everybody's swinging for the fences, it's just like baseball. You're not going to have a very good batting average. If you're trying to hit every hit as hard as you can, you're not going to be really getting things done. And so we started let's hit some singles. Let's hit some doubles. And so First Nations have been proactively moving this bar forward. And the way I like to start looking at it now is we're raising the floor. The ceiling's always going to be there. For most nations involved in the treaty process, the treaty is sort of where it's supposed to technically end. You've defined your relationship with the Crown. But as we've seen with some of the challenges over the recent treaties coming in, what's sort of the First Nations, what's the Leadership Council's, and I don't want to say a position because I know you're three different groups, you have autonomy and you have your process, but just where are you sitting on some of this stuff?
Well, the Leadership Council is an advocacy body, okay? So we're not an organization per se, so I represent the First Nations Summit as elected by the Aboriginal Rights and Title holders, namely the chiefs. So I give acknowledgements to the chiefs, hereditary chiefs, and chief negotiators, as well as, hey, since we're here, the chief executive officers and the staff and everybody for coming here. It's well attended each and every time I show up. And it does show the interest of not only listening and learning, but participating. And I think that's the most important thing, that we want people to be informed. We want people to have the education. So we're seeing that happening in the schools, of course, where young people are learning that the lands that they've been on for thousands of years is First Nations. It's not Indigenous in British Columbia, it's First Nations. And so that is really important with that acknowledgement. But then leading up to the relationships that we have, and we know the past 150 years has been, it's been a colonial history. And we don't have to refer back to the residential schools, the 60s scoop, and the many things that has happened economically as well. And so being probably the most pro-business person on the Leadership Council, I've taken it upon myself to make sure that we interact, that we have these agreements. If we can't have treaties, then we have agreements and other constructive arrangements that will benefit not only First Nations, and especially isolated rural, northern, and interior communities and regions for First Nations prosperity, but as well for those regions all around British Columbia. And I say that because we're looking at the major projects that are coming in now, and we're not at a point where we're saying no. There's a lot of First Nations in there, and you heard it this morning from the chief, that are very much open to doing business. Their doors are open, they want to be informed, they want agreements for their people because of the socioeconomic conditions that we've been in for the last 150 plus years. So that is an important thing to decipher. And a lot of times when you have relationships like what you've already heard, it is a relationship. So it can't be, for example, if I go back to Enbridge, or I go back to, when they wanted to do that pipeline up north that no one really wants to talk about, because it was a lot of times take it or leave it. And there's a lot of court cases out there from Calder, Delgamuuk, right up to Silcoteen and Blueberry that was just mentioned. There's a lot of agreements, for example, like the Haida Gwaii that just happened. And what I would say to people, look, they acknowledge that there's Aboriginal title on Haida Gwaii. Guess what? You still have to stop at stop signs. People were worried about their properties. Guess what? You still got to pay taxes every year on your properties. And all of these things will continue no matter what court case, no matter what happens in any of these elections. And I know I pick on the BC Conservatives every now and then, but I do give acknowledgements to the BC Conservative leader, Finlay. Job well done. It was a squeaker, but you did it. And so, I know it's very important that, in terms of working with, and it was actually Grand Chief Stephen Point that taught me this. And I remember because we were in Victoria, at that time in the 90s, I was the one holding his suitcase, and we were going, and we finished the whole day with the NDP. And I was like, wow, I'm glad that's over. He said, oh no, now we're going to go meet the Liberals because you never know, they might be in power. So, these are the lessons that we learn. But as well, in terms of the work that here today, we have to be informed, we have to be knowledgeable, we have to understand what DRIPA really is. DRIPA is only a toolbox, it's a framework. It's the Constitution that we have, the Canadian Constitution in 1982, not only acknowledges Aboriginal rights and title and treaty, it is very important now that we have these tools such as DRIPA, and there's one in treaty that not a lot of people know about. It's called the Triple R policy. And these are toolboxes where we can start to implement it. So we're not fighting over environmental assessment. So we're not fighting over the Mineral Tenure Act. So we're not fighting over forestry. So that we're working together in co-development. And guess what? We'll align those laws and we'll carry on. We're not co-governing. There's no such thing as co-governing. The government is in Victoria, the provincial government, and they will do, the laws that in order to do, to get the work done, they're the legislators. It is their laws. So what we're trying to do is just expedite this process that the Prime Minister, and I'm glad the Premier is now focused, so I'll take a few shots at the Premier now. No, just joking. But the Premier, again, was enabling this conversation and adding fuel to the fire. And all we were saying is, let's have this dialogue. We'll try to understand what your problem is. Let's stop talking in the media. Let's stop fighting. And so by the fall, we're working on that, setting up a table, very similar. I don't think I'll get fined for saying this, but just like any other table, there'll be technical, legal, there'll be senior officials, and there will be political. And so, that's where we're at right now in reconciliation. And so stop fighting and negotiating in the media, and let's start talking like adults.
I think that's some important points that need to be understood because, we've really picked up our game the last 15, 18 years. When I still remember when Gordon Campbell came in 77-2 in the legislature, and the first thing he did was challenge the Nisga'a Treaty. Remember, he went to referendum. He went to the people of BC, and the people from BC overwhelmingly told him BC needs treaties. So we continued down that path, and they started to figure out how to line things up and get things moving. But, you made a good point about being ready to work. A lot of us get caught up in the farther sides of the political spectrum both ways. It's funny, for years, environmentalists have been our allies and saying, you need to give decision-making to First Nations so they can make the decisions only if they're going to protect everything. And so they were fine with that until we started developing opportunities because we got to pay for houses, we got to pay for infrastructure, we got to pay for wellness centers. And so these relationships are always getting tested. But I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed is watching First Nations communities step up and be able to, ready to, as Mayor Krogh said this morning, ready to dance. They're ready to dance with the left. They're ready to dance with the right. But our relationships aren't with the Conservative Party of BC. We have individual relationships with members, which is awesome. I've always appreciated the support that caucus has given to this event. We've always had 4 or 5 MLAs from the Conservative caucus here. But we're prepared to work with anybody. I know, when Trudeau came in, we thought, yes, we're just going to get everything that we're looking for. It almost got a little bit harder, but we were ready to work with them, and we made some opportunities. So just what's some of the role in the First Nation Summit and the Leadership Council in just helping support nations realize their goals and their visions?
Well, first of all, we got to remember the climate we're in. And there has been racism, there has been prejudice, whether you see it or not. It's a systemic racism that First Nations experience. If you're not First Nations, it's kind of difficult to understand. You can read about it, you can feel it to a certain extent. Certainly if you're of color, you can feel it and understand to a certain extent. But to have a colonial history that we've had, and to have a government that's in place that sometimes, as well as an opposition, and especially those that are some people that are in the legislature that have been making racist, that have been making prejudice, and certainly have been in denialism of some of the history that First Nations have. And it's been very hurtful for a lot of First Nations, but as well the effects that we see in schools with children, what we see in cafes, and again, in the wintertime, I get pretty light, and
Me too.
you know what I mean, and I go around, and some of the comments that I hear just in, right in the next little booths from people are just atrocious. And because they're saying, again, when the economy goes down and unemployment goes up, especially for young people, and whether the deal goes through or not, a lot of times First Nations get blamed. And it's a hard thing to understand. So I commend those leaders, and when I say leaders, I mean industry types too, that are taking the time, because I've seen it. I was in Calgary not too long ago, and I couldn't believe where I was because all these CEOs were getting up and acknowledging all the treaties, and then they were talking about the agreements that they were having, and I was shaking my head. I'm like, where the heck am I? But these leaders, these industry leaders, knew that they had to have that relationship. That meaningful consultation, that you have to have the free, prior, and informed consent as part of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that DRIPA, that toolbox, is just a mechanism. To abolish it is, there's going to be so many problems. I don't even know where to begin legally, because there are agreements in place right now that are working towards getting these major projects. We got to stop fighting. We got to, what's his name? The Minister of Natural Resources, Hodgson,
Yeah.
said there's $1 trillion that are looking at coming into Canada. The bulk of that will be going to British Columbia. I'm not just talking about pipelines. We're talking green energy. We're talking minerals. We're talking all of those things that make sense to a lot of people. And so we've got to stop fighting. You've got to pick up that microphone in your board meetings with your stakeholders and say to the boards of some of these organizations, and I know it's only 3 or 4 out of 9, but boy, they really bring out these press releases that are just incredibly negative, and tell them to stop. To stop, because you're not only you're fighting the First Nations, but that investor is saying, why should I invest there? They're fighting again. So, go to those boards, go to those organizations, go to the municipalities. And I know a lot of the mayors are on board with this, but we just can't believe, again, another controversial statement, what the BC municipalities is saying. It's just incredible. Adding fuel to the fire. And I want that to stop. And I'm calling upon the BC Conservative leader to change, to sit down and talk with the Leadership Council, talk to First Nations, and let's get the record straight that we need to make sure we work together. And that comes from another point. Again, Mark Point, he said to me, after we had some feuds with leaders, he said, we have to work together, no matter who's in power. So this is very important. We're not talking millions of dollars, we're talking billions and billions of dollars that's going to be invested in British Columbia, and we here have to stick together. And that includes when you walk out that door, when you walk down that road, when you go back to your communities or go back to New York or wherever, that you have to say, we're working together. I think that is key and that is important, especially for this forum.
Well said, please. So I want to thank you, and as usual, time just doesn't give us the ability to really break into it, but I know eventually in the next couple of weeks we're going to enjoy a medium grade bottle of wine when you're buying, maybe a less medium grade when I'm buying, unless we're at my lodge.
He doesn't mention Tulalip, eh?
No,
when we meet down in Tulalip. That was before Trump, by the way.
Yes, that's true. But I just want to thank you, and I do know that I have very high expectations and try to hold the Leadership Council accountable, and I think that's why we have the good working relationship, is because we can have those hard discussions which prepare us to have those discussions with people in the rest of the rooms like this. So as much as I'm going to give you a shit, I'm also going to give you a pat on the back and thank you for the timeless work that you do in helping in these trenches. I don't think people realize it's one thing to read about it in social media, but when you're in the trenches dealing with this and people are calling out your families, I said the same thing about the Premier yesterday. He's a man who's been elected and he needs to be held accountable, and we try to hold him accountable, but at the end of the day, he goes home to hug his kids. He goes home to pay his bills and does what he needs to do, and that's the same for all of us in this discussion. So just to echo Robert's comments is, if we can just take that meanness down a notch, we're not all at keyboards all the time, and so we need to have some face-to-face dialogue where we can be a little bit more genuine with each other. So as usual, I appreciate the time. You and I both hate keeping people from lunch, so
No way, go.
yes, please. So thank you all. We appreciate the patience with the audio challenges we had, and we look forward to continuing the day. So thank you, my friend.
Well, thank you very much, Dallas and Robert, for closing out our morning session in such a great way. We are going to break for lunch here. So first, we'd just like to say a big thank you to Motion Canada, Inc., who are our generous luncheon sponsors. There's no formal lunch program today, so we really encourage you all to use this time to network and connect with your fellow delegates and our exhibitors. Lunch is buffet style, so I'm guessing a pretty long line will form when you all exit the room. Please have a bit of patience. I think we have 6 buffet tables, so it should go pretty quickly. And please just follow the instructions of the VICC staff. Otherwise, we will reconvene here at 1:25 p.m., and we look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you.